just a minute and then we shall start at 12:01. Give some time for all the AI note takers to join the room. The times that we are in. Okay, we're at 12:01. Let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our first webinar Wednesday of the year. I'm Sugeshni Subrayan, Head of Marketing here at Mint Group. Thank you for spending a part of your day with us. Some quick housekeeping before we start. This session is being recorded, so you can rewatch it later or share it with someone who could not join live. The Q&A is open throughout, so please feel free to drop your questions into the chat as they come up. Now, given that it's February, let's start with a Valentine's Day version of Zero Trust. So Mo and Beyond, please don't shoot me here. But traditional security is a bit like old school relationships. You meet someone, you trust them, and from that point on, they have the keys to the house. No questions asked. Hopefully it works out. So Zero Trust takes a very different approach. Zero Trust says, I like you, but I'm not handing over full access just because we met once. Trust is not assumed. It is earned, verified, and re-verified continuously. You can come in, but I still want to know who you are, where you are, and whether this behavior still makes sense. So in theory, it is a much healthier relationship. Clear boundaries, no blind trust, constant check-ins. The problem is that zero trust, like relationships, does not survive on good intentions alone. So left unattended, people stop checking in. Exceptions get made, just this once. Boundaries soften. And over time, the relationship looks nothing like what you originally agreed to. Nothing explodes, it just quietly drifts. And this is what today's session is really about. Not what zero trust is on paper, but what it becomes in real life once the excitement is worn off. Where it quietly slips, what actually needs attention week to week, and how to treat security as an ongoing discipline rather than a one-time setup. So if zero trust is already in place in your organization, this session will help you work out whether it is truly embedded or simply enabled and left alone. So to unpack this properly, we're joined by Bian and Mohammed, who spend their time dealing with zero trust as it actually behaves, not as it is described in diagrams or Valentine's Day analogies. So with that, I will hand over to Mohammed, our head of MSP, to get us started.
Thanks, Sugeshni. And a lot of what you said is going to come out in the dialogue that we have, in terms of verification always. But I wanted to touch back on day one that we had last year. In the series that we focused on, we established a few common foundations. We discussed why traditional perimeter-based security no longer works. We unpacked the core principles of zero trust. And we explored how identity becomes the new control plane, particularly in Microsoft modern environments. We looked at zero trust across key domains, and whether you call them domains or pillars, it depends on the industry. But you look at identities, devices, applications, access, and data. And we addressed common misconceptions, including why zero trust is not just multi-factor authentication or VPN replacement or a single product. It's a holistic view around the organization. So day one was about understanding the what and the why. And day two is about the how, and more importantly, how to sustain your zero trust over time. Now, we didn't want to do a death by PowerPoint presentation, so we have a presentation just with headers, but we will be having a discussion between myself and Bjorn around those elements. And as Sugeshni pointed out, please post those questions into the chat, and we'll tend to them. And that brings us to the big question everyone keeps asking is what exactly happens after day one? And after day one, meaning after project implementation. Beyond, let me bring you in here. What does day two of Zero Trust actually mean?
Certainly. Thank you, Mo and Sue, for the great introduction. So when we talk about day two, we're really talking about the point where the work actually begins, as you've mentioned. Day one is all about getting those controls in place for our pillars, such as identity, devices, the access, the data, as a whole foundation. So, but where day two comes in is where these controls start to live and breathe and evolve, or adapt, if you will. So in essence, day two is the shift from deploying the zero trust to operating and governing it in a way that's sustainable. So it's about continuously fine-tuning and validating, as well as optimizing what's been put in place. So that needs to stay effective within the real world and not just on paper. Very similar to what your introduction also alluded to, Sue. Thank you so much.
So Bjorn, you touch on a good point. How does Zero Trust actually become a risk to the business?
So that's a great question, Mo. So this is where posture drift, which we will touch a bit on more later, but posture drift becomes a real risk because without ongoing oversight, exception will creep in. We start slacking. And then when we start slacking, things start to fall out of alignment. We suddenly have all these blind spots we didn't intend to create, or it just appeared. So day two is all about preventing exactly that. So we want to keep zero trust aligned with the business, with it adapting as the environment changes, and we need to make sure that we don't lose that momentum after the initial day one rollout.
So that's day two, but here's the reality we all see out there. A lot of Zero Trust initiatives start strong and then they just lose steam. Now, we all know when we work with this why it happens. But for the benefit of the audience, let's touch on that and let's elaborate on why does it actually happen from a deeper level perspective.
Certainly. And unfortunately, it's very common. And honestly, it comes down to one simple thing. Zero trust gets treated as more of a project instead of the operating model that it is. So most organizations that we've come across approaches it like there's some sort of finish line. We deploy MFA, we tighten a bit of access, maybe roll out some device compliance policies, and then it becomes a tick box exercise, and we assume, or they assume that they are done. But zero trust was never meant to be something that you just switch on and we walk away from.
Yeah. So what you're saying is without clear ownership, without meaningful metrics, ongoing oversight from leadership, even the best designed controls start to weaken over time. And this is where we speak about exceptions build up. A small change here, a small change here that is never documented. These policies eventually fall out of sync with business changes. And people bypass things more for a convenience sake, whereas we know security is not there for convenience, it's to protect the organization. And that's where posture drift creeps in, quietly, gradually, and often without anyone noticing until there's a problem or a breach. So if momentum fades because the mindset was wrong from the beginning, zero trust only works when it's treated as a living discipline, an organism within the organization, something you review, you define, and operationalize, not just during the initial rollout, but continuously over the organization's journey.
100%, man. And I just want to touch a bit more on the posture drift that we've mentioned, if we can just unpack that a bit. So what exactly is posture drift and why is this so dangerous?
So that's a great question. Posture drift is actually a gradual misalignment of security controls and regional policies, often caused by exceptions, unplanned changes, lack of review from leadership. This creates an invisible risk. Everyone thinks on paper everything is secure, but gaps quietly emerge and widen. We all know that there's policies and there's technology, and they should both be aligned. If you're going to change something in technology, we should adapt the policy and vice versa. So again, systems may look secure on paper, but the gaps quietly emerge and the cracks widen. Because posture drift is subtle and builds up through small, unnoticed changes, organizations must monitor and correct it proactively. Otherwise, zero trust defenses can weaken without warning.
And that makes complete sense. And something we often want to emphasize with our clients, or not often, we most regularly try to emphasize with our clients is the leadership angle that comes with this. So why does zero trust, or why would zero trust require the executive's visibility?
So, zero trust isn't just a security initiative. It directly impacts access, productivity, risk exposure, and compliance across the entire organization. And those are business level concerns, not just IT ones. When executives have visibility, the trade offs we make along the way become intentional. Decisions are grounded in risk and not in convenience or assumptions. Leadership can clearly see how zero trust affects identity, the access, the data we spoke about. Um, and without that visibility, zero trust gets stuck in the technical layer only, not in the policy or the governance. And with that, you ensure that the security outcomes stay aligned to the business objectives, and you maintain the operational support, the funding, the accountability that's needed to sustain zero trust long after the rollout or implementation of it. Now, we've mentioned the pillars, devices, identity. Um, let's help the viewers connect to the dots. Why is identity considered one of the control planes of zero trust?
So that is essentially because every access decision starts and ends with identity in its context. It's not just who is the user, it's we're looking at the workload that's being run, the device that they're on, or the session risk that comes with that risk at the moment, and what the policy's intention was for. So all that converges at the identity layer, which is where we evaluate that risk and enforce that policy within real time. So in practice, the identity becomes the traffic controller of zero trust. If it's where we verify explicitly, we still apply the least privilege, and we continuously reevaluate whether the access should still be granted, or if the conditions changed, or should it be revoked. And that's why we call the identity the control plane. It's still the point where the policy, risk signals, and the business intent needs to produce that decision. I hope that answers your question, Mo.
Absolutely. I think it's great insight for the viewers. So let's do another quick sanity check again for the viewers. Are simple controls like MFA or VPN enough to claim zero trust maturity?
No, that is the short answer. So MFA, yes, it's absolutely still essential, but that's not the destination. So with zero trust maturity, that actually means that we want to continuously evaluate the access, not just from a sign-in perspective. It's using that risk adaptive policies that factor in the user or the device health, as I've mentioned, or the session behavior, and then the action being taken. So we still need that least privilege access that I've mentioned and the device trust, but we also need that ongoing validation throughout the session. So if risk spikes, the access needs to adapt or it needs to be revoked. So MFA, if we can put it this way, helps us still keep the bad guys outside the door, but zero trust is what's keeping us verifying after they potentially have breached and as that situation changes. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely does, yeah.
But before we go a bit deeper into the day two operations, I think here's something that people often misunderstand, and that's what I've mentioned, continuous verification. What does that look like in practice? If you can just deep dive us a bit into that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's the same intro that Sue gave us, the continuous verification component. And I think zero trust really differentiates itself from traditional security models. Continuous verification means trust isn't a one-time event at login. Pretty much what you said. It's something that gets reevaluated throughout the entire session. Every action, every request, every change in context triggers a fresh check. We look at things like device health, user behavior, location changes, risky logins, or even not risky logins, depending on where you are, compromised credentials, and threat intelligence, the full spectrum of signals and metrics. If anything shifts out of the norm, the device becomes non-compliant, behavior looks suspicious, or the risk eventually spikes. And access can then be restricted, challenged, or revoked in real time rather than reactive. And I think that's the important part. It's the reactive component versus proactive.
Yeah.
And that's how you prevent attackers from exploiting the gap between login and lateral movement. It's not trust and carry on, it's trust and verify again and again and again continuously.
Sticking with signals, Bo, so device posture is a pretty big one. So how does that factor into the operational zero trust?
Yeah, that plays a massive role. At the end of the day, zero trust isn't just about the user, it's about what they're using to access the environment. Device
Yeah.
posture tells us whether the device meets organization security requirements. Is it compliant? Is it managed? Is it healthy? Is it up to date? And of course, has it been tampered with? And if it has been tampered with, obviously, then we can not allow that device onto the environment. Unmanaged, non-compliant, or unhealthy devices introduce a much higher level of risk, purely because data may be on the device, which will be privileged information. We can't just have a check that once at enrollment assumes it's clean. The posture must be monitored continuously because devices drift, as we mentioned. Policies change, apps fall out of date, they need to be resynced or updated because of bugs, and users find creative ways to ultimately break things. Operational zero trust means that device posture becomes the real-time enforcement signal, not a checkbox. If the posture dips, access should immediately be adapted. Logging and visibility is one of those items that plays a big role in operational zero trust. With that said, let's move into the operations and let's talk about a bit about logging and visibility and why it's a big priority for day 2 or operational maturity.
Of course, because without proper logging or visibility, we are basically flying blind. On day 1, we have designed and deployed the controls, but within day 2, we need to prove that they are actually working. And the only way to do that is through comprehensive telemetry, right? So if we don't have the right logs, we cannot demonstrate that control effectiveness, and we can't detect potential misuse or misconfigurations or potential compromise. And we certainly can't show audit readiness, which is a big risk, because zero trust isn't something we need to trust is working. We need to verify and back it up with evidence. So visibility, in turn, is what turns zero trust from a theory into something that's measurable, that can be validated and continuously be improved upon, which is also very important. So that is how we can catch that posture drift that we've mentioned early, to see behavioral anomalies, and we need to confirm that the policy is being enforced, that it was intended for what it was created for.
I think that makes absolute sense. And so we've spoken about that. Let's talk about scale and with brute force attacks, threat intelligence coming in, there's a variety of metrics coming in. How does automation support zero trust operations? Because I think that's an important element leadership, technical people want to understand. Is it one person looking at 100,000 metrics coming in every day? How does that automation actually help?
So automation is what allows the zero trust model to operate rather at a speed of risk and not the speed of a ticket queue. So we as humans, yes, we are great at making decisions, but we're not so great at repeating the same tasks 1,000 or 100 times on a consistent basis. And that's where the automation helps to eliminate that human error factor, and it keeps that enforcement consistent. And that lets us respond to threats or changes in posture near immediately. So not after we've eventually get to a backlog item.
So it also accelerates policy updates, right? Because we need to be looking at those
Yes.
remediation steps, identity or device enforcement. And so when that risk changes in real time using automation, the environment adapts in real time too. I think that's what you're trying to say is that's the whole spirit of zero trust. Continuous verification, continuous control, and automation is actually the engine that makes this possible. Let's take it a step further, and we've spoken about automation. Let's talk about AI and the changing game in its entirety. In a mature zero trust environment, where does AI actually add some value to zero trust?
Great perspective, Mo, because AI becomes more of a force multiplier once the fundamentals of the zero trust were put in place. And at that point, we are going to be generating a huge amount of identity data, device posture signals, behavioral insights, and audit logs. So that's far more than any human team could correlate manually, because that will, of course, take up a lot of time and we may miss something. So this is more the portion where AI shines because it can analyze the identity, the device, the behavioral signals at a larger scale, and it finds those patterns and anomalies that would have been impossible to detect by us as humans. So things like subtle lateral movement or compromised tokens, device drift, or even suspicious access patterns from a specific user, or deviations from a user's normal day-to-day behavior. And I think where AI also comes in is it also helps us prioritize that risk by highlighting what matters right now for us, like which identities, the sessions, so that we as the security team can respond faster and much more accurately. And instead of spending hours of crawling logs, AI surfaces those meaningful insights, tangible insights. So when we look at a more mature zero trust environment, AI, we are not saying that AI isn't replacing people. Apologies. AI is not replacing people. That's not what we're saying. It's more about removing that noise and exposing those real risks and giving the security teams rather the clarity to act more decisively. So that in essence is the value. So intelligence at the scale and speed that what zero trust truly requires. So if we can just circle back to the topic of the operational side of zero trust like 2, Mo, what would your insight be for what are the roles that's required to sustain the zero trust in the long term?
Well, this is quite a long topic, and I'll try to keep it short. But to keep zero trust alive beyond the project implementation or the initial rollout, there needs to be good technology. Naturally, you need to have the right operational ownership wrapped around that technology. So first off, you need clear security ownership, a team or a function that is accountable for the zero trust operating model, not just the deployment. Someone has to be responsible for maintaining that posture, reviewing the exceptions, monitoring drift, and continuously improving controls. How do we review exceptions? By change control. Have a proper change control process in place, because if we do need to change something, and it happens more often than not, the policy needs to be changed as well, not just the change control approval from a technology perspective.
Yes.
Second, you need policy governance, right? So zero trust introduces guardrails that affect identity, devices, data, and access. And those guardrails evolve naturally in any organization. The governance ensures that policies stay aligned to business needs and to the risk appetite. Then there's, of course, operational accountability, the day-to-day ops. Day-to-day tasks like responding to risk signals, enforcing device posture, managing the identity lifecycle. That's all integrating the telemetry that cannot sit in the background. Someone must own them, even though we have AI and we have automation. Someone needs to own that to make sure that it is still working as it is, and it's supposed to be. And once there is a threat or a perceived threat, there needs to be an enforcement of the device posture, an enforcement of non-compliant identity, as an example. and reviewing those privileged access and integrating telemetry cannot sit in the background. Someone must own them operationally. And lastly is business engagement. At large, it's the leadership. Zero trust impacts how people work, their access, their productivity, sometimes even their processes. It cannot live only within infrastructure or identity teams. The business must be part of the decision-making, escalation, and governance. Zero trust is sustained when technology, operations, and business share the same responsibility and common goal, not when it's trapped inside a single engineering team. Hope that answers the question, Bjorn. And without belaying the point, let's move on to the operational structure for a moment. And let's talk about why zero trust fails if there isn't strong ownership.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mo. So in essence, without clear ownership, zero trust becomes everyone's responsibility, which means in practice, no one is responsible. So when there isn't a defined owner, nobody can be held accountable for monitoring that posture drift that we've mentioned, or reviewing the exceptions, or notice when controls are starting to decay. So policies then in turn gets relaxed quietly over time, as you've mentioned earlier as well. So, and those risk signals then in turn goes unaddressed, and the entire environment slowly slips out of the alignment of the original zero trust implementation's intent. So effective zero trust isn't about having just the right configurations, but it's about assigning those responsibility for outcomes. So as I've mentioned, someone has to be accountable for making sure that those controls stay healthy and that telemetry is being reviewed so that those exceptions don't pile up. So in summary, zero trust just fails without ownership because you cannot contain a living operating model on autopilot. Someone must own the posture, the process, the performance of the zero trust in order for that to work. So I hope that covers everything from your side, Mo, because
Yeah.
I have a question for you, because something that can undermine even the best zero trust design is how the organizations handle these exceptions. So what would the right way be to approach exceptions in a zero trust model?
Absolutely, Bjorn. So exceptions are unfortunately unavoidable, right? That's the reality of it.
Yeah.
But they're also one of the biggest dangers if they're not managed properly. Every exception should start with a risk assessment, and in line with the risk assessment, probably a change control request or a care board within the enterprise or the organization. We need to understand what exposure we're introducing and why it's necessary in the first place.
And this must be time bound, right? Because an exception that lives forever is no longer an exception. It's the new default security policy that no one approved. So if we don't put those expiry dates on them, they'll just quietly stack up and then we hit more blind spots.
Yeah, exactly. And between creation of these undocumented policies versus expiry, every exception needs to be continuously monitored. So we need to know if the risk changes or if the exception starts being abused or misused. And once we see that the creation and expiry date starts, going longer and longer and longer, like you said, it's no longer, it's the new norm, and we need to update the policies to make sure that they are now aligned.
One more point to this, just to wrap this kind of up, is that the regular review needs to be part of this because exceptions cannot go into some drawer somewhere and we forget about them. There needs to be a formal review cycle so that we can confirm that those exceptions are still necessary, or if they are no longer necessary, we need to remove them. Because unchecked exceptions are the fastest way that we are going to undermine a zero trust posture.
Agree. Thanks for that, Bjorn. What we've seen in our implementation is we see a lot of teams focusing heavily on the technology itself. They want to get the project implemented, but not necessarily on what the technology is meant to achieve. Let's chat about the difference between managing tools and managing outcomes in the zero trust model.
So managing tools is basically we're just keeping the lights on and we're making sure that all the platforms are up, or patched or configured. But that just tells us that the tech is running. It doesn't tell us if it's doing anything for our security. So, because managing outcomes is different, because it's about whether those tools are actually reducing risk or tightening that access or preventing that drift and making the business safer and more efficient. Because we can have perfectly configured tools, but still not move that needle if you're not measuring things like the risk reduction or at least privilege cleanup or resilience for that matter. So for me, zero trust isn't just about running those tools. It's about making sure that they are actually delivering on the outcomes that they were bought and implemented for.
You make a valid point. And so how do we with the zero trust implementation approach an audit and compliance readiness assessment?
So zero trust shifts us more from a point in time evidence to continuous evidence. Instead of us having to scramble for screenshots and once-off reports for audits, if upon request, we can always show a trail of what mattered. 3 points I can think of is access decisions, like who or what requested what access, what was the risk associated to it, and was it granted or denied by an admin, for what reason. The second point, control enforcement, like which policies evaluated the request and how that enforcement adapted within real time. And the last point is the policy adherence. We need to prove that identity, device, data, and session policies remain aligned because, and essentially were those timed out and reviewed, because that's the big win. Auditors and risk teams get evidence with the context. It's not just a static snapshot. I hope that answers your question, though.
Yeah, it does, absolutely. Thank you, Bjorn. Um,
So, Mo, if I may, I have one more question for you. Now that we've covered the operational component, can we just discuss more of the services side of the house? How are managed services evolving into modern trust environments?
yeah, that's a great question. I think they're changing dramatically. We've spoken about multiple layers here, automation, AI, the planes or the pillars, so to speak. Traditional managed services were built around reactive support, service desk, ticketing queues, waiting for tickets, and fixing those issues, keeping the systems running. But in a zero trust world, that model just isn't enough anymore. Managed services are shifting towards proactive posture management. Instead of waiting for something to break, they continuously evaluate identity posture, device health, policy alignment. So you see a lot of the managed services start engaging with leadership to make those policy enhancements to make sure that the new norm is in the policy, which is what it should be. They're also becoming insight-driven. With the amount of telemetry Zero Trust generates, service providers are now expected to surface trends, identify the drifts, highlight opportunities for improvement on a continuously basis. And we've seen that over the last 6 to 8 months with our customers. They want to highlight opportunities to improve their environments and how to effectively optimize their controls, not just maintain them.
Yes.
Ultimately, managed services and modern managed services provide continuous assurance. They help organizations prove their controls are working. They show evidence for audits. They can track exceptions, with change control using service desk, and keep zero trust aligned with business objectives. So the evolution is clear. From fixing tickets to managing outcomes, that's what zero trust actually demands.
Gotcha. Thank you, Mo. So we've covered the operational side, the service side, and the governance side. But if we can just talk about proving value, how should zero trust actually be measured? Because as we've observed, that's where most of our organizations struggle.
Yeah, I completely agree. And this is where teams often default to tool uptime or number of policies deployed. I mean, we've had one customer this week, they've got almost 370 policies deployed, but in general, it's challenge managing those policies, which doesn't tell you anything about real security impact. Zero trust success needs to be measured in terms of outcomes, not activity.
Exactly. And I think one of the clearest indicators is reduced attack impact, fewer successful compromises, a smaller blast radius uh, if a compromise had occurred, and faster containment of that. So if zero trust is working, attacks should have less room to move, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, there's fewer saying privileges. Over time, you should see excess admin rights disappear. Privileged accounts reduced, access becoming more dynamic and risk adaptive. Think about the likes of JIT and PIM, for those that don't know the acronyms, so just in time, privileged identity manager. How do we shift and adapt the environment to be able to use JIT and PIM effectively as part of zero trust?
And on top of that, we get improved visibility because success means that we're no longer operating in the dark. We know who accessed what, from where, on which device, if it's compliant, and under which conditions. That alone, I think, raises operational maturity.
Yeah. Don't forget faster incident responses. With continuous telemetry, adaptive controls, investigations become far quicker and far more precise with less manual correlation, especially when it comes to internal breaches or data leakages within the organization.
I think just one last piece to add to that is the alignment to the business risk and risk KPIs. Like trust isn't just a security framework, it's a business resilience framework rather, because success looks like security outcomes that directly supports the operational goals, the compliance needs, and what the risk appetite was.
Yeah.
Is.
So zero trust success is measured by outcomes. We've said that before, and I think it'll never go stale. It's not about tools, it's not about checklists. It's real, tangible improvements in information and security, visibility, and business alignment.
Mo, let's talk about the other big one. If we can talk about cost, because that's one of the first questions we're going to get from leadership or potentially our audience. Does zero trust increase or reduce operational cost in the long run?
Let's face reality, right? There's always an initial investment, and that part is true, right? So once zero trust matures, the operational cost picture shifts dramatically. So you'll have the initial investment from a service perspective to implement the tools, the day one component we spoke about earlier, and then you have to mature that into the operational picture. Now, a mature zero trust model should reduce long-term costs by lowering the breach impact, simplifying access models, and cutting down on manual work. We spend less time firefighting, less time reconfiguring broken controls, and far less time managing permissions. Again, using JIT and PIM as an example. And of course, one of the biggest expenses is your exposure and reputational damage to any organization. I think that is one of the biggest expenses any organization will hate to pay the cost of that.
Of course.
So yes, upfront efforts exist, but operationally, zero trust becomes far more cost efficient than traditional perimeter model ever could. And so let's circle back beyond. And we have zero trust intent, the day one, versus achieving zero trust maturity, which is what we're speaking about today. Let's close off the discussion and let's explain what is the difference between the two at a high level so that we can wrap up the session.
No problem. Thank you. So intent is more about deploying those controls, like as we've mentioned, implementing a MFA, rolling out conditional access policies, putting compliance policies in place, which is important, but it's just the starting point. Maturity is more about sustaining discipline. It's that ongoing visibility, the governance, the posture management, that exception handling, and continuous verification that ensures that the zero trust stays effective as the business grows. As we know, threats evolve on a daily basis, as well as technology shifts rapidly. So intent, in summary, builds the foundation, but maturity keeps the house standing.
Great conclusion. And from my side, I would say day 2 of Zero Trust is where strategy becomes discipline, and discipline becomes the resilience.
Yes.
Zero Trust isn't just a project you finish, and walk away. As we've said, it's a discipline you sustain when identity, visibility, automation, ownership all work together. Zero Trust doesn't become the security model, it becomes the business model, the business advantage that leadership can measure themselves against to make sure that there is no risk within the environment.
Right.
I think that brings us to the end, Bjorn.
That brings us to the poll. Yes, Mo.
Yeah, so I want to thank everyone for joining us at this point in time. I think we are 40 minutes into the call. There is a poll that we've posted, and in short, it's how would you like to engage with post event Zero Trust operational readiness overview. If you can give us some of your info around that, and we can pick it up from there. We'll give you a few minutes to complete this poll, and then I'll hand over to questions and answers, and then to Sue afterwards.
I don't see any questions in the chat. So if you could just, yeah, so we're getting some responses in for the poll. You can keep those going. And yeah, if there are any questions, if you think of anything that you couldn't have thought of now, you can always reach out to us, and Mo and Bjorn would be happy to help. But we can move on to the next slide then. And it really just brings us to the end of the session. I really want to thank Bjorn and Mohammed for the insights, and thank everyone for taking time out of your Wednesday to join us and being part of the conversation. But before we wrap up, I want to quickly share what's coming up next month, because it sparks it speaks to a feeling I think many of us are carrying right now. AI is moving incredibly fast. Every week there's a new tool, a new capability, a new opinion on what you should already be doing. It's really exciting, but it's also really overwhelming. There's a lot of pressure to look like you have a plan, even when you're still figuring out what actually makes sense. On a lighter note, I genuinely feel like I might be the only person who hasn't posted their GPT caricature results yet. And, I love a good trend. But that tiny moment captures something real. There's this constant sense that everyone else is already ahead, already experimenting, already publishing something clever, while you're still asking yourself what the right next move is. And that's exactly what our March webinar is about. It's called Want AI ROI? Start with people, then process, then AI. It's a practical, honest session about why so many AI initiatives stall and how to slow things down just enough to focus on what actually delivers value. Clear problems, solid processes, and people who feel ready rather than pressured. So if you're feeling the excitement and the anxiety at the same time, like I do, the session is exactly for you. So we'll be sharing the registration details shortly. It should be in the chat now. I see that, and we hope you'll join us on the 11th of March. Thank you so much again for spending your time with us, and have a great rest of the week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.